The smell of dirt and diesel hit me before I saw an excavator tearing into my family's lot. HOA President Victoria Whitmore claimed the land belonged to a community project she approved without my permission. I'm Ethan Caldwell, and my family had protected that property for decades. But the deeper they dug, the stranger everything became. To understand why, I need to take you back to the morning it began. The morning before everything changed started like any other workday on my property outside Pinecrest Valley, Colorado. I was standing beside the old fence line with a survey notebook in my hand, checking the measurements for a small restoration project I had planned on my family's unused lot. The land was not abandoned. It was quiet, but it was mine. I had inherited the 1-acre parcel from my grandfather, and my goal was simple: preserve it, keep the taxes current, and protect the piece of land my family had held onto for decades. I had spent the previous week reviewing old county maps and repairing sections of the wooden fence that had started leaning after years of weather. Then my phone rang. It was a neighbor, Daniel Harper, and his voice sounded different. "Ethan, are you aware there are survey crews on your lot?" I looked toward the property line and saw orange flags planted in the ground. A white pickup truck was parked where my grandfather's old storage shed used to stand. I walked over and found 3 workers reviewing a set of plans. "Can I help you?" I asked. The man holding the clipboard looked uncomfortable. "We are here for the Pinecrest Valley Community Expansion Project." I told him this was private property. He checked his paperwork and said, "The HOA approved the work." That was the first moment I realized something was wrong. I drove straight to the Pinecrest Valley HOA office, carrying my deed folder in the passenger seat. Victoria Whitmore was sitting behind a glass desk surrounded by development plans and framed community awards. She was calm, professional, and almost too prepared. "Ethan, I was expecting you," she said. I placed the documents on her desk and asked why contractors were on my land. Victoria folded her hands and explained that the HOA had identified my lot as an unused parcel that could benefit the neighborhood. She said they believed the property boundaries and community agreements allowed them limited access for improvement planning. I asked to see the agreement that gave them permission. She opened a file and showed me a map with a highlighted section near my property. But something immediately caught my attention. The highlighted area did not match the legal description on my deed. I pointed it out. Victoria paused for a moment, then smiled and said, "These things can be complicated, Ethan. We are trying to create something valuable for everyone." I left her office with more questions than answers. That evening, I compared the HOA map with the county records on my computer. The boundary issue was only the beginning. Hidden inside the documents was a reference to a previous land survey that I had never seen before, and according to that record, my grandfather's empty lot was connected to something the HOA had never mentioned. The reference to the old survey stayed on my screen long after midnight. I kept zooming in on the county record, comparing the faded lines with the deed my grandfather had kept in a metal box for almost 50 years. The problem was not that the HOA had the wrong map. The problem was that someone had created a newer map that quietly ignored part of the original property history. The next morning, I drove to the county recorder's office with one goal: find out who changed the records and why. The clerk, a woman named Susan Miller, pulled up the archived documents and placed several folders on the counter. "This one is the original parcel survey from 1974, she said. "This one is the updated subdivision filing from 2018. I opened the older file first. The boundaries match my deed exactly. Then I opened the newer filing. A narrow section along the eastern edge of my lot had been marked as a future community access area. I asked Susan who requested the update. She checked the signature page and pointed to a name I recognized immediately: Victoria Whitmore. My stomach tightened. The HOA president had not simply misunderstood the property lines. She had personally submitted documents connected to the expansion plan. But when I looked closer, I noticed something unusual. The filing did not transfer ownership. It only referenced a possible access arrangement that had never been finalized. Victoria had built an entire project around a possibility that was never legally completed. I returned home and called her office. I expected an argument, but Victoria surprised me. She answered calmly and asked me to meet. When we sat across from each other at a small coffee shop near the subdivision entrance, she did not act defensive. Instead, she explained her side. "Ethan, Pinecrest Valley has been struggling with growth. Empty parcels make development harder. The community needs this expansion. I told her I understood wanting improvements, but improvement did not mean taking control of someone else's property. Her expression changed slightly. You really believe this is just about your lot? She asked. That question stayed with me. I asked what she meant, but she changed the subject. She talked about investors, permits, and deadlines. She said if the project failed, dozens of homeowners would blame her. For the first time, I saw something different behind her confidence. Pressure. But pressure did not explain why my grandfather's property was suddenly the center of their plans. That afternoon, I returned to the lot and walked the boundary line again. Near the far corner, where the grass had grown higher than the rest, I noticed a piece of old concrete barely visible beneath the soil. It looked like part of a structure, not random debris. I cleared away a small section and found a rusted metal marker with faded numbers stamped into the surface. The marker matched a symbol on the old survey I had just reviewed. Then I noticed something even stranger. The HOA's new construction plans were designed directly over that exact location. The old metal marker sat in my workshop for hours while I tried to understand what I was looking at. The faded numbers were not part of any recent HOA survey. They matched the original county records from 1974, the same records Victoria Whitmore's expansion plans seemed to ignore. I knew I needed answers before the construction crews came back. The next morning, I called my grandfather's old friend, Walter Bennett, a retired county surveyor who had helped document properties throughout Pinecrest Valley decades earlier. When I showed him a picture of the marker, he went quiet for a moment. "Ethan, where exactly did you find this?" he asked. I told him the location. His response changed everything. Walter explained that the marker was not just a boundary reference. It was connected to a restricted survey area created during the late 1970s. He did not know all the details, but he remembered county officials treating that section of land differently from normal property. "Your grandfather was very careful about that lot," Walter said. "He always told me there was a reason he never developed it." That was the first time I realized my grandfather had not left the land empty because he had no plans for it. He had protected it. I returned to the lot and started looking through the old documents my grandfather left behind. Buried between tax records and maintenance receipts was a handwritten note inside the same metal box that held the original deed. It was only a few sentences, but one line caught my attention. "Do not allow anyone to disturb the eastern section without proper review." I immediately called the county planning department. I expected confusion, but instead, the official I spoke with asked me a question that made my concern grow. "Mr. Caldwell, who told you to look into that area?" I told her nobody had. She paused and said, "Because someone recently requested historical records related to that exact section." I asked who made the request. She told me she could not release private information over the phone, but she confirmed it came from someone connected to Pinecrest Valley Estates. That afternoon, I reviewed the HOA expansion proposal again. This time, I noticed something I had missed before. The community project was not simply placing a walking path near my property. The plan showed underground utility work running directly across the eastern section of my lot. Victoria had not just planned to use the surface. She planned to disturb whatever was beneath it. I went back to her office with a copy of the construction plan and asked her directly why underground work was scheduled on my property. For the first time since this began, Victoria looked genuinely surprised. She looked at the document, then quickly recovered. "Ethan, you are making assumptions based on incomplete information." I asked her what information I was missing. She did not answer. Instead, she told me the HOA had already invested significant money into engineering studies and legal preparation. Then she said something that made me realize this was bigger than a neighborhood improvement project. "You need to understand, Ethan, stopping this project will affect a lot of people." I left her office knowing one thing. Victoria was not trying to take an empty lot anymore. She was trying to reach something underneath it, and now I had to find out exactly what it was before her construction crews got there first. The next morning, I learned how quickly a person could go from defending their property to defending themselves against an entire system. I opened my front door and found a certified letter from Pinecrest Valley Estates sitting on my porch. The paper was thick, the kind designed to make people nervous before they even read the first sentence. Inside was a formal notice claiming I was interfering with a legally approved community improvement project. The HOA was demanding access to my lot within 14 days for necessary infrastructure evaluation. It was the first time they stopped asking and started acting like they already owned the outcome. I took the letter to a property attorney named Rachel Morgan, someone who specialized in land disputes and local development issues. After reviewing my deed, the HOA documents, and the survey records, she leaned back in her chair and pointed to one section of the paperwork. "Ethan, your ownership is clear, but that does not mean this will be simple." She explained that the HOA was not claiming ownership directly. They were building their argument around a possible access agreement, historical references, and the assumption that previous owners intended the land to be shared. Someday, it was weak, but not impossible to challenge quickly. Then Rachel showed me something I had not considered. The HOA had already submitted engineering plans to the county. If the county approved those plans before the dispute was resolved, stopping construction could become much harder and more expensive. For the first time, I realized I had been fighting yesterday's problem. I was trying to prove the land was mine, while Victoria was already preparing for the future. I needed a different strategy. Instead of only defending the property line, I needed to understand why that exact section mattered so much. Rachel helped me request the engineering documents connected to the expansion project. When they arrived, one detail immediately stood out. The underground utility path was not the shortest route. It was not even the cheapest option. It was deliberately designed to cross my lot. There had to be a reason. I returned to Pinecrest Valley and watched workers placing new survey stakes near the eastern edge of my property. Victoria was there speaking with the construction manager. She noticed me and walked over. This time, she was not smiling. "Ethan, I hope you understand what you are doing," she said quietly. I told her I was trying to protect my property. She looked toward the marked ground and lowered her voice. "You have no idea what you are protecting." That sentence stayed with me. It was the first time Victoria sounded less like someone defending a project and more like someone afraid of what would happen if the truth came out. That evening, Rachel called me after reviewing another county file. Her voice was different. She said she found a document that changed everything, but it was not in my grandfather's records. It was a sealed municipal archive request submitted years earlier by someone connected to Pinecrest Valley Estates. The sealed archive request became the first piece of evidence that made me believe we had finally turned the corner. Rachel Morgan helped me file a formal inquiry with the county, and within days, the pressure shifted. The county planning office temporarily paused the expansion review because the submitted plans required additional verification. For the first time since this started, Victoria Whitmore was no longer moving faster than everyone else. She had to answer questions. The construction crews stopped placing new survey markers. The access request against my property was placed under review. I remember standing at the edge of my lot that evening, looking at the quiet field, thinking maybe this was the moment things finally started going back to normal. But Rachel warned me not to celebrate yet. "Ethan, a delay is not a victory," she said. "It just means everyone has more time to prepare." She was right. 2 days later, Victoria requested a meeting with me and Rachel. I expected another argument, but Victoria arrived carrying a folder instead of a stack of demands. She looked tired, not defeated. She explained that she had found additional records showing the eastern section of my property had once been part of a county preservation project. She claimed she had not known the full history when the expansion plans were created. For a moment, I wondered if she was finally being honest. Then she placed a document on the table. It was an old agreement signed by my grandfather. According to the paper, he had allowed temporary access to the eastern section of the property decades earlier for county maintenance purposes. Victoria pointed at the document and said the community believed that agreement created a shared interest in the land. Rachel studied the paper carefully. She did not panic, but I saw her expression change. The document was real. It was not enough to give the homeowners association ownership, but it complicated everything. I had spent days proving they could not simply take my land, and now they had found a piece of my family's own history that could slow us down. After the meeting, I asked my grandfather's old records to be reviewed again. This time, I was not looking for proof that the land belonged to me. I was looking for what my grandfather had been protecting. The answer came from a box I had never opened before. Inside were photographs, handwritten notes, and a letter from a county engineer dated 1978. The letter mentioned a protected underground facility, located beneath the eastern section of the property. My hand stopped moving as I read the final sentence. The facility was not abandoned. It was still registered as an active historical resource. But the biggest surprise was not what was buried beneath my lot. It was the name listed on the original preservation request. The person who signed it was not my grandfather. It was Victoria Whitmore's father. For several minutes, I could not take my eyes off that signature. Victoria Whitmore's father had not just known about the land. He had been part of the reason the eastern section was protected in the first place. The same family that was now trying to control my property had once helped preserve what was underneath it. I brought the documents to Rachel the next morning, expecting her to see a simple connection. Instead, she noticed something I had missed. "Ethan, this changes the entire case," she said. The old agreement was not a transfer of ownership. It was a preservation arrangement between the county and the original landowners. My grandfather had not given away the property. He had allowed limited access so the underground site could remain protected. The empty lot was never empty. It was a protected historical resource sitting beneath private land. That changed our strategy completely. We were no longer fighting only against an HOA trying to expand. We were dealing with a development plan that could interfere with a registered preservation area. But the biggest surprise came when Rachel uncovered why Victoria's father's name appeared on the documents. He was not a developer. He was a county preservation engineer who had fought to protect the site decades earlier. Victoria had inherited the knowledge of the land, but somewhere along the way, that knowledge had changed into an opportunity. I wanted to believe she had simply made a mistake. Then Rachel found the engineering request submitted by Pinecrest Valley Estates 6 months earlier. The request specifically mentioned removing the old underground structure to make room for new utilities. Victoria had known enough to understand what was there. She just never told anyone. When I confronted her, she did not deny it. For the first time, she dropped the polished HOA president image. "Do you think I wanted this situation?" she asked. "I spent years trying to keep this neighborhood alive. The expansion was supposed to protect everyone's investments." I asked her why she never mentioned the preservation records. She looked away for a moment. "Because I knew people would stop listening to the project once they heard the history." Her answer was not an excuse. It was an admission. But Victoria was still not finished. She explained that contracts had already been signed, permits were moving forward, and investors expected the project to continue. If she stopped now, she would lose control of everything she had built. That was when I understood the real battle. Victoria was no longer trying to prove she owned my land. She was trying to prevent the truth from stopping her project. Rachel immediately filed for a formal review of the construction plans, but before the hearing date arrived, we received unexpected news. The county had discovered that Pinecrest Valley Estates had already scheduled excavation work near the protected area. The most important evidence in the entire case was still underground, and someone was about to reach it before we could legally stop them. The county notice arrived before sunrise, and the first thing I noticed was the date on the construction schedule. Pinecrest Valley Estates was planning to begin excavation in 3 days. 3 days before anyone could complete a full review of what was beneath my property. Rachel read the notice twice, then placed it on the table between us. "They are trying to create momentum," she said. "Once enough money is spent and enough work begins, they can argue that stopping the project causes too much damage." I understood what Victoria was doing. She was not trying to win the argument. She was trying to make the argument too expensive to continue. That changed my approach. I stopped chasing every move the HOA made and started building the strongest possible record of what they already knew. We organized everything we had collected. The original 1974 survey, my grandfather's handwritten note, the 1978 preservation letter, the engineering plans showing the unnecessary underground route, the archive request connected to Victoria's family. Every piece told the same story from a different angle. But Rachel pointed out one problem. We still need to prove intent. The documents showed what happened. They did not fully explain why Victoria chose this path. Then I remembered something she said during our coffee meeting. "Stopping this project will affect a lot of people." At the time, I thought she was warning me. Now I wondered if she was admitting something else. I requested the original planning materials from the HOA's public meeting records. This time, I was not looking for land ownership. I was looking for the moment when the project changed direction. 2 days later, we found it. The first version of the expansion plan did not include my property at all. The underground utility route was added months later after the HOA received information about the protected site. Victoria had not discovered the problem after planning began. She changed the plan after learning exactly what was underneath my land. That was the peace we needed. But Victoria was not sitting still. She scheduled a neighborhood meeting and presented the expansion as a choice between progress and delay. She never mentioned the protected site. She never mentioned the old records. She showed residents beautiful drawings of new community spaces and told them the project had already gone too far to stop. I watched neighbors who had supported me begin to hesitate. Some were not defending Victoria. They were simply afraid of losing the improvements they had been promised. That was the hardest part to accept. The fight was no longer just between me and the HOA board. It was about whether the truth could compete with a vision people wanted to believe in. The night before the hearing, Rachel called me with one final update. The HOA had submitted a revised argument claiming my grandfather's preservation agreement created a shared responsibility for maintaining the underground site. It was a clever move. They were no longer denying the history. They were trying to use it against me. Rachel looked at the document and said one sentence that made me realize the final battle would not happen over what was buried beneath my land. It would happen over who had the right to decide its future. The hearing room was smaller than I expected, but the tension inside felt bigger than any courtroom I had ever entered. On one side sat Victoria Whitmore with the HOA representatives and their legal team. On the other side, I sat with Rachel and a folder filled with decades of forgotten history. For the first time, Victoria was not standing behind a construction plan or speaking to a neighborhood crowd. She had to answer questions directly. Rachel began with the simplest point. Pinecrest Valley Estates never owned my lot. The expansion project was built on the assumption that my property could be used, not on an actual transfer of ownership or completed access agreement. Victoria's attorney responded quickly. He argued that the preservation agreement created a shared responsibility and that the HOA was acting to protect a resource that benefited the entire community. It was a smart argument because it shifted the conversation away from control and toward responsibility. For a moment, it looked like they had found a way to survive. Then Rachel placed the original engineering plans on the table. She pointed out that the HOA had changed the utility route after receiving information about the protected site beneath my property. The room became quiet. Victoria leaned forward and finally spoke. "I never intended to damage anything," she said. Her voice was different, not defensive, almost exhausted. She explained that she believed the project could preserve the neighborhood's future while protecting the historical resource. She admitted she made decisions quickly because investors and homeowners were expecting results. I understood something in that moment. Victoria did not see herself as someone taking something. She saw herself as someone managing a problem. But the problem was that she made choices about my property without my permission. Rachel then presented the document that changed the direction of the hearing. It was not the original deed or the preservation letter. It was the timeline of the project decisions. The first expansion plan avoided my land. The later version targeted the exact area where the protected site existed. The question was no longer whether Victoria knew about the history. The question was why she continued after learning it. Victoria looked through the documents carefully. For the first time, I saw uncertainty on her face. But then her attorney introduced their final defense. They argued that the underground resource had never been publicly accessible, had never generated revenue, and had remained unused for decades. Their position was clear. They believed the community's future development rights mattered more than an inactive historical site. It was the strongest argument they had made, and it forced me to confront the one thing I had avoided from the beginning. Protecting the land was not enough. I had to prove why what was beneath it mattered to everyone, not just my family. Rachel looked at me before the final presentation and asked if I was ready. I opened the old metal box my grandfather left behind and placed the last item on the table. It was the one document I had not shown anyone yet. The room went silent as Victoria recognized the handwriting. Because the person who wrote it was not just connected to her family's past. It was the reason her entire argument was about to collapse. The document I placed on the table was the final piece of the puzzle. It was a letter written by Victoria's father in 1978, explaining why the underground site had been protected and why my grandfather agreed to preserve the land around it. The letter was not about ownership. It was about responsibility. Victoria's father had written that future generations needed to understand that some places carried value beyond money or development. Rachel pointed out the most important sentence. The preservation agreement depended on maintaining the land exactly as it was unless every affected owner and county requirement was properly reviewed. Pinecrest Valley Estates had done neither. The hearing room changed instantly. The HOA could no longer argue that they were simply improving and used property. Their own project documents showed they had planned construction over a protected area without completing the required review process. The same records Victoria hoped would help her defend the project proved that the project had moved forward too quickly. The final decision did not erase every mistake overnight. The county required the HOA to stop the expansion plans affecting my property, remove the unauthorized survey markers, and restart the approval process if they wanted to propose any future work. Because the HOA had already spent money on plans and contractors, homeowners questioned Victoria's leadership and demanded a review of how the project had been managed. Victoria remained seated after the hearing ended, looking at the documents that had once represented her confidence. She did not look like someone who had lost a battle. She looked like someone realizing she had misunderstood the thing she was trying to control. Later, she admitted something to me that I did not expect. She said she should have asked my family about the land before making assumptions about it. I appreciated that she finally understood the difference between managing a community and deciding what belonged to someone else. A few weeks later, I returned to the lot where the excavator had first appeared. The dirt had been leveled, the survey flags were gone, and the quiet field looked almost exactly as it had before all of this started. The same place Victoria once called an unused parcel was now recognized as a piece of protected history connected to the community's own past. I still kept my grandfather's metal box in my workshop. Inside were the documents that helped me protect the land, but the most important thing it gave me was not a legal advantage. It reminded me why my family had held on to that property for so long. When the HOA looked at my land, they saw empty space. I saw everything that was still waiting to be remembered. Justice belongs to those who protect what is truly theirs.